All right, I am going to talk about putting PostCSS into a Sass-based workflow. They come together and wow, pretty awesome. But I'm also going to do it kind of in the context of talking about how I, as a developer, deal with things like that weird combination of fear and laziness and pride that makes us unwilling to try new things or to improve certain parts of our workflow. And I'll start that story, I guess, 2.5, 3 years ago, where I was a developer and I was seeing all sorts of great articles about how to use Sass, and hearing my other developer friends talk about how to use Sass, and this is all really fine and good. And I sat there and thought, no, my CSS is great. It doesn't need any help. It's all fine by itself in its 2,000-line files. And I resisted it for a while, and then I went to a conference and I heard some good talks about it, and it gave me enough information to get me past the fear and the lack of knowledge, as well as a boost of encouragement to get past some of the kind of laziness and pride that I had. And I started using it, and it was fantastic. And I dove in completely and learned a lot about it. And then a year later, I found a tweet from myself earlier through one of those little time machine apps. I remember tweeting, why would I need grunt? I have a config Ruby file that Compass runs, that compiles my Sass, and does Autoprefixer. I have literally everything I could want. And then I figured out all the other things I could do with grunt, and I got through the learning curve and overcame fear and put away my pride and pushed through laziness and figured that out. And then I changed jobs a few months later, and everything was based on gulp. And I didn't even have the option at this point to decide, do I want another tool or not? It was, here's the workflow, here's the tool, use it, this is your new job. And so I did, and you would think by the time I got through all of that, I would finally be at the point where now when a new tool comes along, I can immediately calmly evaluate it and integrate it in my workflow and test it. And sure enough, I spent months sitting on PostCSS thinking, no, I don't want to add that. My current gulp flow is really good, and it does all the style things I need. Why did I feel that way? I'm going to talk through some of the reasons here today, and by way of doing that, I'll show you the outline. Why is there a mindset of Sass versus PostCSS? And I'm going to say Sass, I mean any of your traditional preprocessors like Stylus-less or Sass. That's just the one I happen to use. Why did I have that mindset? Why did I have that concern that they were against each other? How can they work nice together? And then just PostCSS, what are some awesome practical things we can do with this tool? So why is there this mindset of Sass versus PostCSS? You may have heard somebody tweet something like, PostCSS is a Sass killer, or now I'm breaking up with less because I have PostCSS, and these awesome like one against each other dichotomy type statements. Where does that come from? And it's not just a PostCSS thing. We do this like grunt versus gulp and React versus all the other things, and Angular and Ember and whatever camp we fall in, we keep like in our minds dividing ourselves and separating ourselves from the people who use that other thing. So let's talk about Sass versus PostCSS. Finish him. I'm sorry, I couldn't, I don't know how to recolor GIFs and make them like the pink and the red to match the branding colors, else I would have. PostCSS is a preprocessor, and Sass is a preprocessor. What do I mean by preprocessor? It does stuff to your CSS before it ever gets to a browser. If you want a literal actual post processor, look up prefixfree.js. That actually runs client-side in the user's browser and adds, in this case, browser prefixes where they're needed on CSS3 properties. But PostCSS is a preprocessor. It runs on your styles before they ever get into a user's browser. Of sorts. It doesn't do the exact same thing. But it is still pre-processing in that workflow. It modifies your styles again before it gets to a browser. But it doesn't replace preprocessors. Some people will use it to do so, and I'm not saying they're bad or they're wrong or in any way denigrating their work. That's a choice you can make, and there are plugins for PostCSS that will mimic all those things if you want them to. But it doesn't do the exact same thing. It doesn't modify CSS in the same way that traditional preprocessors do. PostCSS is this awesome $10 word for the day, an abstract syntax tree parser. What in the world is that? By way of answering, let's look at what CSS actually is. What kind of code is this? Well, it's a text file, right? And it all goes to the browser, and but it's actually an associative array full of nested arrays, right? Okay? You've got a key, dot element, and then you've got its value, which is an array of its own. And it's a whole bunch of key value pairs. The key is display, the value is inline block. The key is padding, the value is 1em and 2ems. CSS is by definition, really a whole bunch of nested objects or associative arrays, however you want to look at that. But you can't really parse it as such in your workflow very easily, can you? I mean, browsers know how to do that. They're really smart. But if you want to like do find and replace and automate CSS modification, you want to set up like a whole bunch of really complex regexes, and that's really time consuming and kind of fragile. But what PostCSS does is it converts your CSS, again, it's just a string in a file on your system, into a giant actual iterable object. And with that, it provides you JavaScript APIs to loop through that object and do whatever you want to with the contents of the object. Add things, remove things, edit things. It should be noted first, before we go much farther, that PostCSS by itself does absolutely nothing to your style sheet. It just turns it into an object and turns that object back into a file for you at the end. All the plugins you can get for PostCSS, they make actual changes to your file. And we'll talk about some examples of those a little bit later. So that's what PostCSS does. You can see how very different that is from Sass or less, I'm hoping by now. Let's talk about the individual strengths and weaknesses of these two tools. Yeah, see, they don't have to be like doing ninja kicks in Mortal Kombat. They can be friends. What are the advantages of Sass, less, stylus, the traditional, if I can use that word to describe something that's only been around a few years, preprocessors? They come with a bunch of pre-built features, and they come with a great bunch of community support that's years old. What features am I talking about? Variables. Who loves variables in their Sass? That was, for me, like the one kind of cool thing I could do that got me over the hurdle of not having any Sass to having a little bit. I can put all my colors in variables, and it was magical. And conditions and loops. If this thing is true about a current environment variable or situation, then do this. Or even better, loops, right? Stick all your social media colors in an array, in a map, loop through them all, and create your share buttons. Functions and mixins. These are all really, really awesome. And community support. If you go to your preprocessor that's had years of documentation and open source work, it's got a really great docs page, how to set it up, how to install it, how to use its syntax. Conferences and meetups, certain preprocessing languages have their own conferences every year or two. And then blog posts and tutorials. And I want to be careful here. I don't want to imply that these things are not present with PostCSS. They are. They're just less developed because it's a younger technology. And in some ways, sometimes they are a little more fragmented. If you want to use Sass with your project, you can find all the Sass documentation in one place. If you want to add optional toolkits to it, like Suzy for grids or something else, then you find documentation on those toolkit author websites. With PostCSS, as I mentioned, PostCSS does nothing to your code. The plugins for PostCSS do everything, and each one of those is at its own stage and maturity in terms of documentation and community support. So by being not as monolithic as an older preprocessor, you end up with a little less, but again, I don't mean to imply that PostCSS has nothing like documentation or support. It does, and it's growing. So I guess that can be a call to action here. Start using PostCSS, learn some stuff, and write about it. Contribute to the blog posts and articles, or post a talk at a conference later. Help document some things. But what are the advantages of PostCSS over Sass, for example, or less? It can manipulate CSS. Sass can't go through and actually manipulate and change existing spec CSS you've written. It can only handle its own syntax and do things with it. And custom syntax, which I'll show you an example of shortly. Let's talk about manipulation in a little more detail. Things like vendor-prefixes and syntax cleanup, sorting and shortening your CSS properties, those can all be handled very manageably by PostCSS plugins. There's no option, however, in Sass for sort all my CSS in the same property order in every selector block. This is an advantage that you get from having that abstract syntax tree parser. Take an example real quick, vendor prefixes. If you're using Sass, you may remember this syntax if you use Bourbon, or if you saw the old Compass library, had almost the exact same, I think, the exact same syntax. Here's how you do a transform rotating something by 90 degrees. That's kind of clunky. That's an awful lot of parentheses. I never typed the word include correctly on the first try. Does anyone? I'm impressed. Teach me how. But what if you could just write this instead? That's spec CSS. That's just plain old boring CSS. And what does Autoprefixer do? It doesn't care what else you're doing. In the background, it quietly goes through, takes your list of browser specifications for your support requirements and says, okay, based on what the developer told me in their config, here are exactly the prefixes I need to add right here next to that property. All automated, all run in the background, very awesome. How about custom syntax? This is kind of one of those, your mileage may vary. I haven't found a custom syntax thing that I've considered worth implementing in my workflow, but should you have a need for this, here's a great way to go. You can make up your own custom CSS properties and then use JavaScript to parse the values you've given them and put out real live, actual browser comprehensible CSS. If you're using Neat or Singularity or Suzy or a similar Sass grid mix-in system, you may be familiar with an include mix-in like this. Again, who types include right on the first try? Extend is even worse. What if you could just write this? It looks a lot more CSS-y. It doesn't really conflict with anything in spec because I don't think that's a valid property at the moment. And you can prefix it with your own thing, make your initials your company name. And you can get the same output by both of them. Sass has a bunch of, or the Sass library you're using for your grids has all the math written into its mixins and functions, or if you prefer JavaScript and are really good at writing all your math in there instead of in Sass, you can write it all there and you can come up with the exact same output. Whenever PostCSS hits a grid span property, it goes through and generates these mathematical values and plugs them into the right properties. Now, how can they work together in real life? You say, this is cool, but does it work for real? How so? I like gulp right now, so I'm going to show you a quick sample in gulp. This part is very boilerplate. If you're using gulp to compile Sass, you probably already have this in your gulp flow. You're requiring packages that you installed with npm install and giving them a variable name aliases in your gulp file. Then here's a task to do that. We start the source maps, we run Sass compiler, here's the output style, we write the source maps, and then we spit it all out in the right destination directory. Now let's add a few more packages that run PostCSS things. The first one is the big obvious one, PostCSS itself. And then 3 really helpful tools I found are Autoprefixer, CSS Nano, and PostCSS sorting. By the way, cool thing, maybe it's a secret. If you're running gulp PostCSS or grunt PostCSS already, gulp Autoprefixer or grunt Autoprefixer already, you're secretly running PostCSS. It's actually bundled inside of those native, and they're not native. They're just a wrapper around PostCSS running nothing but Autoprefixer. So if you're using that, you're secretly using PostCSS already. And now here's a new task for that. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create an array PostCSS tools that has instructions for how to use Autoprefixer. These are the browsers I have to support because my boss said so, or because that's what's worth the money. And then we're going to run the sorting one as well. And then if the production variable is true, because we've told it that with a flag while we're running gulp, then we're going to add CSS Nano, which is a fantastic minifier, to the process as well. And then same thing, we take the source file as a CSS file we just made with the Sass task. We run PostCSS tools on it, and we spit it back out in the same directory. That's all it takes. If you're not familiar with gulp, I'm sorry, this may be confusing, boring code to look at. But the point is that it's very simple in principle. You bring in the right packages you need to grunt or gulp, give them the right variable names, put them in an array, and spit it through a new task. In fact, optimize this, you wouldn't even run 2 different tasks. You would run the PostCSS process at the end of your Sass task to save one file right on your system and be a little quicker. So you can check that out. There is a gist I've got up with sample code in there if you would like to go there. These slides are live and clickable and stuff, so you can get to them. Their link is on the bottom, and you can get further information from all the links that are in here. So what are some practical tips for using PostCSS? We're getting into the part of the slides that's a couple, 3 slides of just my opinion. There are other developers who use PostCSS in ways that I don't recommend, and that's fine. If you justify it, if it fits your use case, if it makes your workflow better, use it that way. Here are the things that I found I prefer to do. Some cautions, and it's just like, I prefer to keep my non-CSS in the Sass, in the older preprocessor, and just use PostCSS to turn CSS into better CSS. So you'll notice I didn't have a package installed in the sample gulp file that made up custom CSS properties. The grid span I showed you in the example, there actually is, if you want it, a good library called Lost Grids that does provide a way to use custom CSS-looking properties and put all your grid syntax into there. And I should clarify, I'm not saying grid syntax like we heard about grid syntax from Justin earlier, not the actual CSS grid layout, just float-based stuff, but it does the math for you. That kind of grid. Columns is really all it is most of the time. But anyway, as a little rabbit trail, I like to keep my PostCSS workflow just turning CSS into better CSS. If a style sheet gets to a user's browser without all the right vendor prefixes, some things might break. But it's, for the most part, it's all valid CSS, and there's not a property in there that the browser can't understand unless it doesn't have a prefix yet. If you run something like a custom property or some CSS that doesn't exist yet into a browser that somehow misses your PostCSS workflow, the browser just won't know what to do with it. So I prefer to use PostCSS to just turn CSS into optimized, faster, lighter, better compressed, whatever you want to call it, CSS. And then I want to recommend that you be very, very careful with polyfill code. That's a fun little word. You've probably used a polyfill at some point. How many of you remember sticking HTML5 shiv/shim into the header of all your sites? Yeah, it's polyfill. That tricks old IE into rendering HTML5 elements correctly, right? Polyfills, typically in JavaScript, are really good in that they're testable and they're stable. You use them to turn browser APIs that don't exist yet into valid JS functions that do exist and that do run. And when those aren't supported by the browser, this extra bit of JS makes it happen. CSS doesn't have anything like that. If you want to actually polyfill CSS in a browser, you can't do anything with, let me put it this way. If we could write a whole bunch of older existing CSS properties that did the exact same thing as the new next coming not-spec yet CSS, we wouldn't need the new next coming soon CSS. Okay? There's no such thing as a literal polyfill in CSS. You'd kind of have to write that in JavaScript. So there's a great little a PostCSS library called CSS Next. If you want to get your feet wet with new CSS that's coming down the pipeline that's been approved by one browser and behind a flag in the other, and not yet in the other three, and we may never see it in Internet Explorer, or very late in Safari, cool. CSS Next is a great little PostCSS plugin that will let you write that brand new, not even approved everywhere CSS. I'm talking like custom properties. You may call them variables, or grid layout, some of these things. It will write the next best thing with existing CSS, but be aware, it's not identical. So if you're using something like CSS Next or another way to implement future CSS that's not spec, not approved, not implemented, any stage along that, just be really aware that you have to go back and test everything that existed beforehand. Make sure you check it out in not just old browsers, but your modern browsers that may not have that implemented correctly, because the best PostCSS can do in that is write the next best CSS to what you're really aiming for with a new property. Not to say don't use it, just be very careful and test it really, really well as you go. Now I have a list, I'll go through quickly for you, of cool plugins I think you might enjoy in PostCSS. You can manage your prefixes, as has already been noted, with Autoprefixer. You can sort your properties with PostCSS sorting. You say, why do I care what order they're in? Or doesn't my linter already do that for me in my IDE or in Sublime Text? And that's cool if it does. If you're using server-side gzip compression, which I hope you are, and if you don't know what that means, talk to maybe somebody on the back-end team at work, or talk to your hosting company, see what needs to be enabled. If you put the properties in the same order every time, gzip compression can compress more text. It gives a server-side optimizer more room to work with. So whenever you can, sort your properties consistently. Minifier styles of CSS Nano, and this is a lot bigger and better than just running the minified output flag on Sass or running CSS minify in an existing like gulp or grunt plugin. The number of config options you have with CSS Nano is remarkable and really well documented and highly worth sticking in there. Most of the time, minifying is just like collapsing white space. This does even more than that. If you had a 0 pixel measurement, it'll take the PX for you and remove it and make things even lighter everywhere that needs to happen. Improve it more. Who likes Flexbox? Who hit a bug with Flexbox ever? Yeah, I should see about all the same hands up there. Philip Walton has a fantastic repo on GitHub called FlexBugs, where he documents and provides workarounds in many cases for a lot of common but not yet fixed Flexbox bugs in modern and major browsers. Here's a PostCSS plugin that implements those fixes automatically in the background without you having to think about them whenever that's possible to automate. Inheriting legacy code with like 9 different versions of basically the same blue hex code, but just 1 decimal off. Or the proverbial joke, 50 shades of different gray colors. Yeah, we've all heard that one. This will tell you where they all are and help you clean them up. If you're using Google Fonts, you can just stick in the name of the font, and there's a plugin that will automatically create the font face import and all that for you. You can analyze your CSS, and this is really fantastic for working on teams where you want to have code reviews and find out great data about what you're actually doing. CSS Stats dumps a ton of data into your console or wherever things are going during your workflow about how many different selectors you're using, how many different properties you're using, and all sorts of great things. List selectors does the same thing, but with just one deal, selectors. You can lint your styles with style lint, and if you're on a team that uses BEM, then you can go ahead and make sure that you're doing that correctly with a linter for that too. All of this is possible with PostCSS plugins. And then there's a list of further reading. I won't read you all the titles. In fact, I'll go ahead and finish up a couple minutes early. Thanks so much for listening. It's been a great joy to share this with you. I'm James Steinbach. As Poch mentioned, you can find me almost everywhere on the internet at JD Steinbach. And if you have further questions or feel like I owe you 4 more minutes worth of content, catch me later this week and ask me more questions. Thank you very much.